Hello, everybody. We're live, I think.
Yeah.
The internet is working as intended.
Excellent.
So, good morning, good evening. We are all around the world today. So, welcome to our panel about Beyond World Building. Wow, I already messed it up. Beyond Western Medieval Fantasy Global World Building. Today, I have with me a panel of award-winning writer designers who work at tabletop, and I am going to pick their brain about how they approach game design, narrative design, as well as world building in their games, especially as people of color who are, often drawing from their cultures and cultures beyond the world. The point of this panel is to talk about how we can all, those of us who are hobbyists and professionals in game design, make worlds that are not Eurocentric, because I am a little tired of the Tolkien fantasy being propped up everywhere. With that in mind, we are going to jump into quick introductions. My name is Indrani Ganguly. My pronouns are she, they. I will be the moderator for this panel. I am going to throw it to you, Viditya. We'll start with you.
Hey, everybody. My name is Viditya Valeti. I use he, him pronouns. And I am a game designer. I feel like that's a common thread here. Yeah, that's me.
Pam?
Hi, I hope you don't hear the noises of a Filipino household in the background, but yes, I'm Pam Punsalan. My pronouns are she, they. I am currently based in Ontario, used to be in Manila for the majority of all the big bad cons that I've been a part of. Because I know Indrani's going to do this, I am a Nebula finalist for Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel together with Bashir. I also have some credits in Hunter the Reckoning. I'm doing the Blades in the Dark supplement. I've done Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Inspire and Shadow Operations. I do a lot of my own personal projects, but I've done a lot of other systems as well, beyond hand and community stuff. So that's me.
Candy.
Hi, yes. My name is Candy Williams. She, her pronouns. I've been playing TTRPGs for about 20 years. Started in the community in 2019 as the executive producer and GM of the Dicey Amazons. And am also currently freelancing as well as writing and designing my own games.
Bashir.
Hello, I am Bashir Gauss, a game designer, writer, and cultural consultant in the space. Like Pam, I am a Nebula finalist for Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. I've worked on Journeys, I've worked on Lost Omens for Pathfinder, I've worked on stuff for Starfinder, Spire, Kobold Press, a lot of companies in the space, and I am thrilled to be here to talk about this.
You are currently kickstarting.
And I'm currently
Please talk
kickstarting my first big independent RPG, Guns Blazing.
I swear, these people. Well, that's our panel. They're incredible. We're going to jump into questions. Please feel to drop your questions in chat. They will be sent to us so I can pop them over to our panelists as well. My first question is for everybody. As designers, how do you escape the sort of powerful influence of Western culture in media while working on games that draw from non-Western cultures? And we'll go in the same order as we did introductions. So, Viditya?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, this is a big one. I was thinking about this, like, it's, I think, our biggest weapon, or, like our tool is that it's just a little, being able to pull on something that's like a trope that you always see and like just kind of swapping it out is kind of how I do. I'm like, oh, like what's like a common thread that I can easily kind of smooth in, right? Like kind of change how it plays out. There's like, I think for me, it's like hero's journey stuff and various other kind of structures of storytelling that I like to at least turn a little bit and like figure out how to change And I forgot all my notes, by the way. Sorry,
So
we're all good here. And then like names is another one for me. Is just like, you can toss it. You can almost like force diversity by just being like, no, I'm gonna put a lot of Indian names and various other like cultural names that are outside of just a Western canon, and it starts to slowly kind of work its way. Little building blocks for me where it's like, all right, I'm gonna kind of see what I can shift and move and change a little bit.
yeah, Pam, what do you think?
Well, the difficulty specific to the Philippines is that you really can't escape the Western structure because first there was Spain, so that's like the institution of Catholicism, which later like bled into particular aspects of our culture because of our tendency to be very syncretic with religion. So you take different elements and you kind of mix and match it. You make it uniquely Filipino, which is also a difficult thing to say because we have 7,000 plus islands. So what is Filipino? Like that is always a question that every, I think, creator, whether they know it or not, from my country has to reckon with. Right. So you're living in the shadow of colonialism. You're also living in the shadow of diversity that like you don't really have a choice but to look at because and the usual tendency is to reject that diversity because everybody thinks that Philippines equals Manila, which is the gateway to our country, right? And then you have the Americans, which when they came along, it was a shorter period, but it was intense, is what I'll say, right? So for me, and I say this a lot when people ask me, it's like archaeology. So you have a lot of different pieces that you do not understand, that you don't have the context for anymore, that come from a place that may be foreign to you. So from there, you have to glue a lot of that together using yourself. So it's both an act of looking at what's in front of you and questioning yourself constantly when it comes to world building and like not making it so Western. That's how I handle things. Anyway, I don't really know how to make it concrete. It's all very theoretical, but yeah, that's the process on my end.
I get that feeling of like I'm always having to check myself, being like when I'm writing, where is this coming from? Like, what am I truly drawing this from? Because India also colonized for a very long time by the British. So, I that what you said like really resonates. Candy, what do you think?
Yeah, as Pam and you and Johnny mentioned, it's kind of hard when it's sort of like the majority of what you know. As an African American, like is the majority of what I know, other than maybe what has been passed down to me from family or me going out and seeking it. And so for me, I kind of stick with sort of the 3 R's, which is research, respected resources, and then local sensitivity or beta readers. Um, and so and so at that point like getting in there and doing that research and getting into, like, for me, trying to get into like African culture when I'm trying to pull that into games. You really have to get into like older research and those respected resources, things that have not been torn apart and debunked and things like that. And then just having people from those cultures really say, hey, you know what, this might be interpreted wrong, because you are not fully of this culture, and so you might want to take another look at that.
Yeah.
Bashir?
So yeah, on some level, I don't think it's fully possible to escape the influence of Western culture. Like, I grew up in San Jose, California. On some level, Western culture is in fact going to pervade everything I write. But what you can do is be conscious about what is inspiring you, what sources are you drawing on, and what did the sources you are drawing on draw from themselves. And so you can kind of do this historical work of like looking into where do these ideas come from, how do they affect what's going forward, and how can I be conscious about working with that or mitigating that. This is especially important when you're working with a pre-existing IP, because you're trying to figure out, okay, when they created this setting that I am now working on, what were they drawing on? And what of that do I need to try and excise, or what of that do I need to try to mitigate? And what are native sources to the area or region this is inspired from that I can use instead? And what inspired those native sources?
Yeah, I always love doing this panel because I walk away with like the first question be like, holy shit, I've just learned so much. I'm not sure if you're allowed to curse, but it's,
That's gonna
the
happen.
the second question, and I'm going to tie that with the question we got from chat, is that do you feel the need to strike a balance between staying faithful to like the source, which is the culture that you're drawing from, but also like keeping things digestible for people who might not be familiar with it? And like, does that ever lead to, just building counter Western storytelling modes? Like, how do you sort of contend with that and reconcile these roadblocks when you are writing? Well,
I, I
yeah,
have I have an I have an answer to that already.
Yeah.
this
I
is
think
open to everybody.
Okay,
So like,
cool.
whoever wants to jump in.
like the digestible, right? Versus what do you call it? I don't think about whether it's digestible. Uh, I'm since we're already on the swear train, right? I'm an unapologetic bitch about it. If you don't get it, catch up, keep up. The only time I will change it is if my editor tells me, okay, this might not be clear. Can you please bring your ideas out? Or the system that you are currently working with, which is specifically contextualized to freelancing within a particular system, not your own system, right? That's the only time I'll change it. If you don't get it, I'm not gonna apologize. That's how I do it, because everybody else is basically forced to do what they under. We're all given the illusion that this is the status quo is the problem, but it's not. It's really not. And when you have a predominant culture throughout pop culture, it does create again an alternate version of reality that actually pushes everybody else's specific contexts aside. So then the exercise as a designer is to take that thread that no one else notices and just pull at it the whole time with all your strength. Just keep on going. Like that's how I handle it anyway. Again, if you don't get it, too bad. You're not the reader I was speaking to, apparently. If you do get it, wonderful. Now we can have a conversation. A lot of it is also about intent and good faith, because some people will come into your work just to be mad. And again, I'm not speaking to you because, as I like to say a lot, I don't negotiate with terrorists. So,
Oh my god. There is a.
I love it.
I have like such a. I'm like, wow, my own confidence in my own writing pales in comparison. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's good.
That basically summed up my notes. Like,
building on what Pam said, my main constraint is generally not, is this like digestible or approachable, but do I have the word count to explain this?
Right.
In my home games, inevitably there's going to be a point in the campaign where one of my players who knows what I'm doing looks to me and goes, "This is Sufi mysticism again, isn't it?" And a lot of my home games, my players will just never quite get that, because like they don't like, I won't go out of my way to explain it. But when you're doing a freelance contract, you don't necessarily have the room to explain that. When you're doing a freelance contract, you're often working with base metaphysics that don't necessarily fit the culture you're working with. So especially when I'm working with Islamic stuff in D&D settings, D&D kind of works with like this Western approach to henotheism or polytheism, and Islam is famously very, very monotheistic by the standards of monotheistic religions, where like even the kind of like at its loosest Western D&D style stuff kind of bases itself on like teachings around saints and the like, whereas most mainstream Muslim thought will just go, no, even that's too far. One God, we're not splitting this up any further.
Right.
And so you kind of have to adjust, okay, how do I get that idea across, or the philosophy behind that across, in a situation where you just can't manage it?
Right. Speaking of like adding, Islamic, cultural notes to D&D, I'm actually really curious about what it looks like when you're introducing elements of your culture into settings that you didn't create yourself. Like when you have to be mindful of like pre-existing lore and norms, and 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 how is that different from like say writing something completely that's yours, like Pam said? Then you're like, oh, I'm not restrained by anything. What does that difference look like? Like if I had to like really oversimplify it, how is it different writing for Pathfinder than it is writing Guns Blazing?
So my personal approach to it, which I largely don't recommend as a functional approach because it is kind of time consuming. When I am freelancing for something like that, I often approach it as like his the historian or archaeological perspective where I want to go, okay, how do I make this thing, how do I develop the culture that fits these metaphysics or these rule set or this setting that is also true to the base ideas or philosophies of what the culture I'm trying to bring in. So for like Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, there is this entire like pseudo monotheism thing where the parts of the Thayab Empire don't worship gods as such, and kind of making that work in the context of a D&D setting. Other times it's just, okay, what do I need to leave out to make it work in this contract, just because that's the sort of thing you have to do in this in the industry. But whereas where I'm working with my own setting, like when I'm developing Guns Blazing, I get to go, okay, how do I design the base metaphysics to make this work with my focus on the game? With the cultures I want to focus on for the game, rather than having to work from a Eurocentric perspective or a perspective of what was it? A perspective of how someone else designed their setting.
Right. Yeah, that
Hmm.
I've always been curious because I see, this expansion of like incredible creators being pulled into like these big name TTRPG books. So I'm like, these books carry so much weight with them of like what's come before. So I'm like, how do folks contend with that? And it's good to know what you have to say about that. Candy, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
Briarbrand, the GMS game that you're currently working on, in your words, is a reclamation of stories of the African folktale without the slavery themes.
Mhm.
This is really fascinating to me because a lot of POC cultures have experienced historically significant like cultural trauma. How do we as storytellers and writers and creators navigate telling these stories in a meaningful way and removing ourselves from the hurt without downplaying or disregarding history, because that also seems callous.
Yeah. In this for this particular game, like the the source material, Brer Rabbit and all that, just it was something that I grew up with, and for this particular game, like I wanted something to just to be able to pull that story into the next generation, but we no longer need the colonial slavery themes. We no longer need that, right? And so for me, what I did was finding the main theme of the original tale and being intentional in telling that story. And so again, kind of going back to my research and respected resources, just finding and getting all the information that I can about it, and then just kind of reducing it to that main theme from before, and then building the game off of that. And so in this case, the main theme is just going to be a trickster archetype that uses wits instead of fighting. And so, and that kind of ended up being the perfect theme for a game. And so with that, the game is actually set in Africa. It's not set in technically, the US. And I was also intentional with the locations and the animals that I used. They are native or found in Africa. And so this is going to be sort of a highly art game, and so there's going to be lots of art, and I want that shown in the art, as well as a little bit of information on some of these animals and some of these locations that are found there. And so it's kind of a bit of a learning experience. Like, hey, I didn't know like that this animal is native to Africa, or things like that. And so that's what I was trying to kind of do with that game, is by separating what we no longer need.
So it's like you're learning a lot yourself in the process, and then like
absolutely,
I feel that also like to a degree. It's cool. It's happening.
Yeah, there have been times where I've been like looking things up and researching things for a project that I'm working on. I'm like, oh, interesting. I didn't know this very significant thing about, my ancestors. And that is, that's always like this moment to be like, oh, there's so much there to unpack that I haven't even begun to dig into yet. So I'm like genuinely extremely excited about your game, Candy. I'm really looking forward to it because it like explores one of these like key themes that I've always been curious about. So I'm excited to see how when it comes out into the world, what that looks like. Yeah. Pam, you worked on and created TTRPGs using a variety of systems, including PBTA, FITT, World of Darkness, OSR, D&D 5e, and more. You've created your original games as well. These games contain significant mechanical differences as well as their own pre-established lore. I'm curious if your approach to world building changes when you're creating something from scratch, like your own systems, or working within the constraints of different systems. Like, what does that process look like?
I don't think I'm ever going to have like a good answer to that, honestly, because the one takeaway I've had recently from attending GDC is the framing that you cannot actually bend the player fantasy, the main concept or idea that you are trying to put out. You can literally move everything, especially the flexibility of narrative, like the actual stories that get told, but you cannot compromise the fantasy. Whether you want to make that front and center, or you want to subvert a particular idea that is popular, or you want to expand a conversation, you can't actually bend any of that, really. And then the second least flexible one, and maybe TTRPG writers might get a little upset at this because we constantly have discourse about system matters or system does not matter, right? If you move away from that and you go to video games, system is everything. You cannot get rid of codes. You can't get rid of the sheer amount of time and energy and money that is sunk into production, right? So, and that has me reflecting a lot. So that's part of why the answer that I'll have today is different from the answer that I had in BBC literally just last year, right?
We love to see growth. We love to see evolution. So, just a quick note, folks. Bashir will be hopping off for a few minutes because it is Ramzan Mubarak Bashir, and Bashir will join back in the last 10 minutes of our panel, I believe. So, just so everybody knows, cool.
So I'm not sure really. I think that the best way to look at it, which is, or at least the only real way that I approach it, is trying to understand first what the particular language and context is of the system in front of me, because it's in understanding its themes and what it's trying to do and how it's trying to portray that particular fantasy or subvert it that you can figure out where you fit in when it comes to that thing, right? Like Blades in the Dark started as narrative first, high stakes, big consequences, go out with a bang, rage against the dying light. That's the entire thing about the system, right? Which drew a lot from Powered by the Apocalypse, which is literally in the name, Powered by the Apocalypse, right? But then Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons, done, right? Like you can really see a lot, and especially if you get familiar with different models of mechanics. So when you're making your own, the big question there is, what fantasy are you trying to portray? Right? And that question will never get fully answered you will always run into the sheer limits, whether it's your own energy or your own money or something, right? You're never meant to actually finish the conversation with any design you make. You're just meant to create a piece in which other people can generate conversations and stories around, and where you can also reveal more about yourself in the process. Because if you embark upon the journey of I'm gonna finish it now, you will never be happy, frankly, and you'll
I
also never get done. So
yeah,
There it is.
I've always people say this thing, art is never complete, it's only abandoned, but I've never liked that. So I feel like if you replace the word abandoned with like, what is a single word for like coming to terms with, like, this is where you're at
You've like
and this is where
accepted.
yes.
I always say that, where it's like a work is never finished, but you like accept its place, right?
Yes. I love that.
And you're like, cool, like I'm done.
Yeah. On to the next one. Yeah, that makes sense. Viditya, your incredible portfolio of games, because I don't know if you talked about this in your introduction.
I did not actually.
Yes. So, folks, Viditya has like this prolific portfolio of games. Like there's Till the End of the Night. There's Bloodbeam, Badlands. There's Longsword. I know that the community that I run, Desis and Dragons, actually had people who were participating in the jam for the game that you created. So like, people love your games. I all of them, like when I was researching the panel and some games I've played, like they all showcase like this wide variety of genres and like some truly mind-bendingly like unique mechanics. You're also working on Confluence, an upcoming tabletop RPG, and you're one of the mechanics designer on that game. How do you approach building synergy between your world building and narrative building, especially for games that are like so far removed from like Eurocentric notions and mechanical game design? Like, how do you marry the two?
Right. So I mean, Pam was talking about this too, right? With like systems and design and what narrative you're trying to do. And for me, a lot of it is like, well, okay, so there's like two sides to this. Like when it comes to like world building games or things that I try to get people to like create in my world, like versus like I've created a setting and here's like the system. There's sort of two answers to this, but it's in general, I like to ask questions. Like I think when it comes to getting people to buy into a world and buy into like a culture, or like there's, we were talking about digestibility, approachability for people. At least for my own games and things that I like to do with that is like, well, I want it to be approachable, not to placate, but to like encourage is kind of a thing. So it's like, hey, like, here are concepts from like non-Western ideas that might feel alien or foreign, but then I'll like often like ask a question in terms of like world building. So I give a little bit of, I could give some power. Let players root themselves and their ideas inside of like our worlds. So it's like, I have a game called A Land Once Magic, which is just a world building game. And I specifically call it like a post fantasy game because it's like, it was like my way of trying to be like, oh, it's not really like I like a lot of tropes in Western fantasy. I think, we're talking about it and it's like, I like tropes in Western fantasy. A lot of my way of incorporating my culture and understanding it is also like me understanding it as like diaspora, right? Like born and raised, much like Bashir was talking about, right? Like born and raised here. I can't pull the Western out of me because, the diaspora joke is like, I'm Indian in America, I'm American in India, right? Like, so it's like my games are going to be like that. So to me, it's like approaching it in the same way that like I asked my parents a question about my culture. And then that allows me to then take it and do something with it, right? Like internalize it, research it, contradict it, like all these different things that are coming from a place that I trust. And I try and do that with my games too. With like A Land Once Magic asks a bunch of questions, and these questions are very specifically worded. So it's like you're conscious about the tropes you're using, right? Like, hey, it's post fantasy because it's like there's gonna be maybe like, you know, like kings and queens and monarchy is like a big part of it, and I like that. But then that says something about the world and like a Western way of thinking of hierarchy. So be intentional about it. Be intentional about breaking it, right? Saying like, this is other cultures do things a little differently. How do you pull that, break it apart? And then I'll also go quickly, but like the because I don't know how much time we have, but like
don't worry about it.
The like other side of it, the like design, like the system, right? I feel like I'm talking all system. This also like questions, words are just as much system. There's a great thread that was posted pretty recently about Gubat Banwa, which is like a wonderful game. And the author, I'm blanking on their name.
You mean Joaquin?
Yes.
Makapatag. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Posted about that game about like it's like unapologetically using its language, which I love, and I like I want to incorporate it more that I haven't done myself, but it's like something that I think about in my work also, where it's like, oh, the words that you use to describe stuff, like in that game, you know, that your dice are called the crocodile's teeth, like teeth, and you and that is very unapologetically rooted in that culture, but it's like it allows people, like it's again like this hand to pull people in to be like, cool, you want to do this. There's a common problem that I think we see as like people of color who write games about our cultures is that like not even just like white people, but other people outside of our culture are like a little hesitant to be a part of it, to like play a game. Oh, is this just for y'all? Or like, oh, it's so cool that you made this, but like, oh, like I don't want to mispronounce things. I don't want to all these things. And I'm like, yeah, like that makes sense. But when, and like it's respectful, but also like we make games to be played. And so like the systems, like when I design stuff, I'll talk Longsword really quickly because that's the most recent example, is like that's Arthurian legend, right? Like it is as Western as you can get in terms of like that core kind of Christian like fantasy folklore. But I'm like, cool, yeah, like that's Western, it's approachable, but I really like to like with that game specifically, I was like the mechanics of it, like the narrative arc that I'm asking people to go through, the like the small bits of world building, because it's pretty general world building, but I like structure all of it under this underlying idea that like its facade is Western, but a lot of it's like mechanical ideas, like the destiny track and knowing that you have a death coming up. Like that to me was very reminiscent of stories of like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and like all these things of like, you know, our gods, our epics are like, there's so many examples of like, you know how you're going to die, like, you know, your future, but the idea is how do you get there? And there's like a good, really cool examples that I was told to as like a kid and I read about, and you're like, cool, I want to play into that. And so I kind of get people to play that story through that Western facade. I kind of get my cake and eat it too, right? Like I like knights, but I also like my cultural stories. So it's that, yeah.
I love that. A couple of friends and I, we actually built the world for the game we were going to play in using A Land Once Magic.
Oh,
so some of the questions that are in there from the prompts were just, I was like, yeah, let's expand this. Like we've talked about this area so much, and now we add something else from a completely different area. What does that look like? And it was like really great questions that made us think about the world and like made it feel like truly lived in. So, folks, if you haven't looked at it yet, you 100% should.
much. That's so cool.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. He played like a 4-shot, and it was so fun. Okay. We're going to jump into some questions that we've received in chat. We'll actually go back to the first one because I don't think we fully explored it when I asked it earlier. What is your advice for building worlds that are not just counter Western storytelling models? The person who asked the question often finds themselves pushing against bad tropes, but they are more interested in the celebration of new and interesting ideas and themes.
So I saw that question along like earlier, right? And I've been thinking about it. The problem here is perhaps it's a matter of reframing, because you really can't at this point, Seb. I think all of us already said that in our own words. You really can't avoid the fact that there is a Western storytelling mode that is pervasive across literally all countries. So I think that it is more, ask yourself what you're trying to do here. What actually tickles your fantasy? What does interest you? Oh, I see cat. Sorry, got distracted.
Yeah.
Beautiful cat. Hello.
hanging
Goodbye.
out.
Oh, I want a cat.
Lentils.
It's lentil.
Yeah.
One of the lentils.
But
I
yeah,
am a
right.
fan of top poop.
Like
Go ahead,
I hope I'm not overreading here, but there is an inherent negativity to describing it as counter. You have to counter it. You have to like, let's do the shonen hero thing. What do you really want here? Like,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, the moment you realize that it's all around you is the beginning of how you can find a unique way of telling a story that satisfies you. Because at the end of the day, it's not about satisfying the grand monolith or the supposed monolith of your culture. It's not about repping your people. It's about designing something that you can be satisfied with in this moment in order to continue your own conversation. And you can absolutely get it wrong at first. You can absolutely be dissatisfied with how far you went, but that's all part of growth. So that's my thing. Like, question the very idea that you have to counter it. What are you doing instead? Are you discovering? Are you transforming? Are you changing? Are you fighting? Like, what is it? Because all of that will help you figure out where you're going and where you want to be.
Welcome back, Bashir.
There's a like the term like post-colonial world building. I think there's a lot of people doing some good stuff in that space, but I've also like kind of learned myself that it, at least like for me, the stories that I like to tell aren't post-colonial. I think colonization and that is so inherent to certain like story tropes and storytelling, and also just the history of things. In chat, somebody was like, Arthurian legend is actually like even is co-opted from like Welsh history and folk tales, and I'm like, yeah, like, you know, it's this nesting
Goes all
doll
the way
seems to
down.
never keep going. And so like the like, you know, like you choose the kind of stories you want to tell, and it's a lot of like making yourself apparent and like pushing for it and understanding, and I don't know, like I think that's it. I mean, like Pam said a lot of the stuff that I wanted to say, but it is the
I hope that answers your question. Thank you for asking. We have another one. What is your advice for when you're not trying to depict your own culture but want to leave room for it, and other cultures in the world building? This person is creating a strange secondary world setting with some inspirations from their own culture, which is Egyptian, but not explicitly so. But they're worried that but they're worried that not being explicit will lead to it being assumed like Western or white.
Naming helps a lot here. just knowing if you
Yep.
use names consistently that are from a given culture, people will generally figure it out. Not everyone. Before
Yeah.
I got into tabletop writing, I wrote a setting and story that was very explicitly based on like Asia, South Asia, and like the Indian diasporic community, and I had someone asking me if it was Japanese, despite having names like Bashir and Ravana and the like. And
He got the
took me some,
continent right.
yeah, they got the continent correct. So you're never, there's always going to be like someone in the culture list or in the customer list who just doesn't get it, no matter how explicit you make it. But for most people, for general use, people will get it if you name and are fairly clear about your sources, even if you don't explicitly state them. If you're fairly clear about your art direction, even if you're not explicitly stating it, and you don't need to worry about the strangest parts of your customer base who are going to blindly assume that things are white, even when it's all but explicitly said otherwise.
Y- Yeah, I have that issue at times when people look at Navithem. It's almost as if they're expecting me and Sin to just like suddenly have so many Tagalog names or so many Filipino names in it. And the moment they see Navithem, they're like, is it like a Western thing? And I'm just like, did you like read my book? Apparently not. Right. But again, like I'm being Valley Girl mean about it. But also there is a reason why I am mean and unapologetic about it. Bashir put it so well. Some people are just not gonna get it. And like the last thing you need as a creator is to absorb that anxiety when in fact like you are who you are. The words you spoke come from your own body and your own experiences, right? If someone doesn't get it despite your best intent and your best efforts, that means that they did not read your game. They did not take your game as it should be. That, and is it bad faith or is it just like whatever? I don't know. Maybe it's not even your job to figure that out. Your job is again to be satisfied with your current progress. Like, did you do all of the like Candy's 3 hours? Did you do all of that? Right? Did you go there? If the answer to all of that is yes, even if it's a yes, but maybe, you still created the thing, and now you can create other
Another
things.
thing.
Right, and then you can create even more things. Are they going to be fantastically different from where you started? Oh yeah, probably, absolutely, in fact. But you cannot speak to everybody, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Nor should you be the spokesperson for your country. Right.
I want to I kind of want to pull on that. Like that is the big thing that like I needed to learn this myself, and I think there's a lot of, especially diaspora, that kind of go through this arc of like you're like, oh, I write everything with a Western idea. Like I'm not pulling from my own culture enough, and then you go, I'm holding myself to this unreasonable standard of needing to represent my culture, and like that's like a bad space to be, I think, right? Where you're like, you are now putting so much more weight on being like, for me, like, is this Indian enough? You know, like, is this am I doing everything I can to do, like, you know, and then to me, there was a point where I was like, the people that are like all of the different like Japanese 5e source books that are written by white dudes, like they don't think about that, right? So why the fuck do I need to? Like, it's like, fuck you for like stressing me out to needing to be a monolith for like, you know, an accurate depiction of everything. It's like what I make is going to inherently be steeped in my culture in little ways, and I think that's important enough. Sometimes, right? Like not everything I make needs to be explicitly a part of that culture, but like everything I make is a little bit a part of that culture, right? And people who don't appreciate that won't appreciate it.
I think it boils down to not being able to relate to a culture that is not yours. POC can do that because we have been forced to do that. Whereas like white culture, it's everything. All media is mainly their culture, and so they're not forced to do it as much as we are from birth. And so some people just kind of rail against that. Like once it starts kind of showing up, and we've seen that like everywhere within, even politics and cartoons, and like the whole turning red thing. Like, oh, I didn't like it, and it was basically boiled down to they couldn't relate to the character, because it wasn't a white person. Like if it was a white person, they would have loved it, and I'm sure, and all these other things. But I think I think that's what it kind of boils down to is POC. We can relate to a lot of other cultures, because we have been forced to.
So I have two answers to this as a writer and as a GM. As a writer, like, you want to carry yourself with the authority of someone who's done research on this topic, because you either have done research on this topic or have brought in specialists who can help you out with it, or you have personal experience with it. As a GM, you should carry yourself with the confidence of a white writer in the 80s who saw a book on this topic, decided not to read it, but figured that this made them an expert anyways, and went on to write a module that became the standard for how this setting was depicted in tabletop RPGs for the next 30 years, until literally one person from the culture read it.
I want to scream.
I think also at the end of it all, right, you as a writer have to be okay with being uncomfortable with the fact that you are not part of this status quo that was created against your will. You were born into it, and it sucks, basically. Right? There is some beauty in it sucking, which is really funny and very philosophical, right? But at the end of the day, it is inherently wrong. So since it's inherently wrong, how do you make it right? And that is your personal shonen manga story, right? How do you make it right? You'll never make it fully right, and you don't have to. Your job, at least for me, is to make as many people who reject your ideas uncomfortable while making your own table very comfortable and creating another very comfortable table, right? Because again, don't be like the one true hero. That's a Western trope. Okay, be what you choose to be. Like revel in the differences and find beauty in those moments.
I think that's a beautiful note to draw our panel to a close on. Before we wrap up, if there's any final notes people want to add. Okay, in that case, we're going to quickly introduce ourselves one more time. And as for the questions we weren't able to address because there were quite a few, there is a Discord server for Big Bad Online 2023, and there will be a specific channel where you can go in and ask your questions, and our panelists have gracefully agreed to also go in and answer them. So please head to the Discord server if you want your questions from chat answered, as well as want to ask any new additional questions. With that said, Viditya, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me online at Viditya Valetti, basically everywhere. And you can get my games at vidithyavaletti.itch.io. Where I have a lot of, as Indrani wonderfully said, I have a lot of different games. So there's generally going to be something that I think you'll really like.
Pam.
So I'm the Dovetailer everywhere. I have a card, and I guess that's that. Just look for the Dovetailer. I'm usually on Twitter, unfortunately, and maybe you can connect me on LinkedIn, I guess. So that's me.
The GDC has rubbed off on you. Now you want to do LinkedIn. Bashir.
I am Bashir Gauss everywhere. You can find me there on Twitter. You can find me there on LinkedIn. You might find me on more casual spaces as Havoc Fat. And you can find my current Kickstarter for Guns Blazing at kickstarter.com/gunsblazing.
Candy.
Yes, I'm Candy. You can find me at Candy_Janine, JEANNE, on Twitter and wherever else. I have a card also with a bunch of stuff on my Twitter. So
Yeah.
And I have been Indrani Ganguly. You can find me on the internet as @Nonagon Dice. You can also go to indrani.me/hello for all my links and whatnot. I am a TTRPG writer, new to the scene in that case, but this panel has been incredibly helpful to me. I hope it has been helpful to you as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be back in about 10 minutes for our next panel. We're going to
Thank you,
wave
everyone.
until we are queued out.